some announcement and we'll start the session, Hans. Welcome back, dear participants. We now have Hans Timmer from the World Bank, our partners in this conference. Hans Timmer is the World Bank Chief Economist for South Asia. He assumed his position on January 1, 2019. Before that, he was the Chief Economist for the Europe and Central Asia region of the World Bank. Under his management in ECA, a series of regional reports, most recently towards a new social contract and critical connections, and a series of regional economic updates are produced. Prior to these positions, Timmer was director of the World Bank's Development Prospectus Group. Timmer is a quantitative international macroeconomist and econometrician with 30 years of management experience in leading teams of modelers, forecasters, and policy analysts. His experience ranges from long-term structural analysis of the economic impact of environmental policies, trade policies, and tax reforms to short-term monitoring of the business cycle and analysis of monetary and fiscal policy. The session would be moderated by Professor Dr. Qazi Masood Ahmed. Dr. Qazi Masood Ahmed served Institute of Business Administration, Karachi for the last 25 years as chairperson, Center for Executive Education, and the Director Center for Business and Economic Research. In recent past, he served as a member Tax Advisory Council, the Federal Board of Revenue, Government of Pakistan, member Monetary Policy Committee, State Bank of Pakistan for 5 years, and Chief Economist, Government of Sindh for 2 years. In last 35 years, served both federal and provincial governments in capacity of members of several tax commissions, committees, and task forces, notably member of Panel of Economists, Government of Pakistan in 2008. Currently serving member of Board of Governors, Sindh Education Foundation, and member Advisory Committee of Sindh Government on NFC issues. It's a pleasure to have you both today in this session. Over to you, Dr. Qazi.
Thank you very much. I was informally talking to Hans Timmer for the last 10 minutes, and I was talking that instead of a very formal discussion, we want to have a very informal discussion. And I know Hans Timmer for the last 2-3 years, and everyone in Pakistan know him as he's a well respected person and very popular, and among the economists and the academician and the policymaker, he is known as very well-wisher of Pakistan. He's a South Asian head of the World Bank, and World Bank we know that has supported Pakistan in 2010 flood. When I was chief economist, I have observed, I have witnessed their support in the assessment of the damages and then recovery, rehabilitation, and so on. And similarly, we have the World Bank has done, and Tim was head in 2019 COVID, and we were the recipient of the World Bank support, both the financial as well as the technical. Tim is Hans Timmer is basically now the head, and I was talking to him that currently we are again facing the wrath of the flood and monsoon rains in Pakistan that has devastated the agriculture, livestock, and the many other assets of Pakistan. So I would request Hans Timmer that during the discussion, if he can talk about the current situation and give us some of the suggestion to the government of Pakistan as well as the other people in Pakistan from his own experience, like he is an econometrician, he is a quantitative analyst, he's a policymaker, he's a jack of all. So in that sense, I will request Hans Timmer that he can start now, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Perhaps some things were exaggerated, but one thing was really true. I am a well-wisher for Pakistan, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this conference. I, I'm, I think that the topic of the conference, sustainable development, couldn't come at a better time. It's very relevant for the issues that you mentioned also, the struggle with the floods, how to come out of that. I would have loved to be in person at the conference. I see that there are many friends of mine giving presentations. I see also lots of interesting topics. The social inclusiveness of monetary policy, the non-tariff trade barriers, decentralization, all very relevant topics to ultimately come to that sustainable development. So it's a pity that I can't be there in person, but it's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. Let me start by expressing my sympathy for all the victims of the recent floods. What we see is that climate change is real. It's no longer a theoretical concept, and Pakistan and other countries in South Asia, they are really taken the burden of the consequences of climate change. The floods were what we used to call a once in a lifetime event. But unfortunately, these kind of once in a lifetime events, they have become way too common. And that's one reason why sustainable development, the topic of your conference, is so important. And part of sustainable development should be adaptation policies. And part of sustainable development should be to give countries, but also all people in the countries, the tools to cope with these kind of shocks. What I want to do in this brief talk is to share some elements of our upcoming South Asia Economic Focus. You already mentioned the reports that we write twice a year. We will publish the next one tomorrow. That one is embargoed till tomorrow, so I can't give forecast numbers, but I hope to whet your appetite somewhat for that. And I think it is very relevant for the question that you asked, what should be done now in the face of all these shocks and the difficult macroeconomic situation. So the main observation of that upcoming report is that we are not living in normal times. I already mentioned the once in a lifetime shocks. And when you're not living in normal times, then it's unlikely that business as usual policies are good enough. And it's very likely that countries should try to achieve major transformations of their economies and perhaps even their societies. As I said, not normal times. In a short order, a series of once in a lifetime shocks have hit Pakistan and South Asia. Already mentioned the recent floods in Pakistan, but you can also think about the sudden rise in commodity prices, which is a big hurdle, both macroeconomically for Pakistan and for the people in Pakistan. They were caused by the ongoing war in Ukraine, an ongoing war which is also a once in a lifetime event. Nobody thought that something like that could happen with a high probability. We are still in the wake of the COVID pandemic. We are still struggling with the supply disruptions that created, the big distortions for households, for migrants, and the COVID-19 pandemic was also a once in a lifetime effect. And then you see that many countries are struggling, and especially the countries that did not have their house in order, like Sri Lanka. And they are now themselves in a full-blown economic crisis, a full-blown balance of payment crisis, which you can argue is also one of these once-in-a-lifetime events. And as a result of these crises that are exacerbated by a deteriorating global environment with slowing growth in high-income countries, with tightening of financial markets, as a result of which capital is flowing out of developing countries. As a result of these crises, many people, many households face severe economic hardship. It's not just the people from the floods, it's the people in Sri Lanka that can't buy the essential items anymore. It is across the region, households that don't have food security anymore because of the soaring food prices. When you look at Afghanistan, then households have suffered double-digit income losses. They don't have access to core services anymore. And a special topic in our report is about migration, the role of migration in development, the role of migration to cope with shocks. And what we see is that migrants were especially hard hit during the COVID lockdowns. They faced uncertainty, possible scarring effects. And so a lot of personal hardship because of these crises, but also a lot of macroeconomic problems caused by these crises. And most of these problems, they manifest themselves as tensions on the balance of payments. It is difficult to finance the current account deficits for most countries. That is partly because of the high food and energy prices caused by the war in Ukraine. They have increased in Pakistan, but also in other countries, the import bills. They have created a larger trade deficit, and as a result also a larger current account deficit, which is more difficult to finance. When we look at the slowdown in the global economy at the moment, then we conclude that it's more difficult to sharply increase exports from South Asia because import demand is not growing that fast. That reduces exports, also creates a problem on the balance of payments. When we look at the tightening of the financial markets because of coordinated tightening of monetary policy in high-income countries, then we see that also being manifested itself in problems of the balance of payments, because it makes it more difficult to finance your current account deficits. And when we look domestically, then we see that a lot of countries have run up large fiscal deficits because of the relief efforts in reaction to all the shocks that countries were facing. That in itself is a problem for fiscal sustainability, but it's also a problem on the balance of payments because it adds to the current account deficits. And we see also that recently there was a rebound in domestic consumption, partly because consumption was very muted during lockdowns. There were no ways to spend your income, partly because the credit conditions in countries are still very favorable, but that also adds to the current account deficits and in general the balance of payments pressures. And so, as we discussed just before this session, it is not a coincidence that so many countries are now talking to the IMF. Obviously Sri Lanka, but Bangladesh also approached the IMF, and Pakistan is in its own discussions with the IMF already for a long time. Against that background, what we show in the report is that our growth forecasts for South Asia, they have been downgraded. And as I said, there is an embargo on the report. I can't give you numbers, but let me share one observation, and that is that we expect and we are observing already first signs that in the second half of 2022, the calendar year 2022, there is weakening growth in the region. It's a kind of an inflection point in the middle of this year, and so that leads to a downgrade of our forecast. Still a lot of diversity. Obviously, we see that countries that are specialized in services, they are doing somewhat better than the other countries, and especially the countries that depend a lot on energy imports, on food imports, and on goods exports. They are in a more difficult situation. And obviously, the countries that have more fiscal buffers, they are doing better than the other countries. And also the countries that are not using many of the ad hoc measures that you're seeing at the moment to react to the higher energy and food prices, like price controls or import bans. The countries that can avoid those kind of measures, they are doing better also. But let me get back to the balance of payment problems and the IMF. What you see with the IMF coming in is that they can put countries back on, help countries coming back on fiscal sustainability, on balance of payment sustainability, on financial sector sustainability, and they can help give the countries tools again and buffers again to react to crisis, to cope with crisis like the floods in Pakistan, in a framework that is sustainable in the medium run, and that means some tightening of the fiscal policies and some better oversight and regulations on the financial sector. And often in these programs you see then also an element of targeted social protection, because the measures to bring countries on a sustainable fiscal and growth path, sustainable balance of payment path, to regenerate the buffers for the government, they come often at a cost for households. You take away subsidies, less price controls, and so the most efficient way to compensate for that is with targeted social protection, much more efficient than price subsidies. That's a typical program of an IMF. The region needs it. In my view, Pakistan needs it for sustainable development, but it is not good enough, I think, and even more is needed under the current circumstances, where not just the governments don't have the tools to cope with these shocks, but the people themselves, they don't have the tools to deal with shocks like a pandemic, like floods or sudden rises in commodity prices, and to give people the tools. Just better social protection systems are not enough. It is incredibly important that people get more access to markets, more access to finance, that what I would call the underutilized capacity in the informal sector. Probably 80% of the workers in Pakistan are informal workers, that the underutilized capacity, because women only participate in Pakistan for 25% in the labor market. It is important that these informal workers, that the women are more integrated into into the economy, and that is not only a way of giving them the tools to become themselves more sustainable and to cope with shocks, but then it becomes also a part of overall development, where not just you try to grow the existing firms in the formal sector, but you broaden the base of growth, and you start increasing also the revenues. And so how do you approach that? How is it possible to increase productivity of that big underutilized part of Pakistan's economy? That's not an easy question, but I think one observation is already, you cannot hope that all these people will be automatically absorbed in the formal economy as it exists at the moment. What you see in the formal economy is a lot of labor regulations, a lot of benefits for formal workers, a lot of benefits actually for large companies that have almost exclusive access to finance through banks, that are politically connected, that are relatively shielded from foreign and domestic competition, and are in a comfortable position. You cannot expect that a formal sector that operates as that and has not absorbed informal workers, informal firms for decades, that informal sector will suddenly absorb them. And so what needs to be done as part of the overall structural policies in Pakistan is start thinking from scratch how you can give the people in the informal sector better access. And there's a great opportunity at the moment because the digital services that got a boost during the COVID period are creating now opportunities to get access to finance through fintech. you don't need the traditional banks anymore, and it creates big opportunities for very small firms to start selling through e-commerce platforms or through matching platforms. And what our experience is when we did research is that these informal workers are willing to pay taxes. Those taxes are being paid by these e-commerce platforms. They're willing to become visible because they see the benefits that come with that. Suddenly access to a larger market, suddenly access to finance also, even examples where very small firms found niche markets in foreign markets. And so that should be a big part of sustainable development in Pakistan also. It is important to become more sustainable in terms of adaptive policies to avoid as much as possible the impacts of climate change. It is important to become more sustainable by having more fiscal buffers so that you can react to the shocks. It is important to become more sustainable by including more people in targeted social protection systems, by getting the financial sector in order. But ultimately, I think the most important way of becoming more sustainable is by becoming more inclusive in the economy, by making sure that the people that are underutilized now, the women, the informal workers, the very small informal companies, that they become more part of the economy. They get the tools and they start competing also with the formal sector and ultimately competing also with the international sector. It's a general story. It requires a lot of detailed policy changes, but I think one conclusion of this kind of crisis is that no country comes successful out of a crisis like that without transformational reforms, and this is the time to go for these transformational reforms. And I saw many topics in the conference that actually gives an entry point to start discussing what should be changed. And so that's why I was really impressed when I saw the conference, and I'm incredibly happy that I can be part of it. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Hans Timmer. It's very useful, and you have mentioned almost all points from balance of payment to budget deficit and informal economy and all that. In fact, I will then request the audience if they want to ask any question. But before that, I want to make a small comment that in the last 1 month, when we are facing the huge flood and devastation and all that, the informal sector are playing more important role in the welfare as well. And in most of the people think that it is not the government, but it is the NGOs, it is the philanthropy institutions, it's the informal sector basically are playing the very important role. So I think your suggestion that perhaps this is a good time to make them in the integrate in the formal sector and provide them the access to the other facilities as well. Perhaps this will, at least in the short run, may solve the problems of Pakistan economy. But in the long run, in the medium run, as you have mentioned, that we have to make the informal economy into formal economy. We have to resolve the balance of payment issues. We have to resolve the budget deficit issues, especially the non-development expenditure and so on. So thank you very much for your very enlightened discussion, very useful. As usual, it's very useful. So I will then now request Bushra, Dr. Bushra Yasmin, to basically ask or arrange the people who want to ask any question from Hans Timmer.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Timmer. I'm Sadia Shirbaz, and I hope you can